Hello friends, welcome back to our channel. Today we're taking a deep dive into the reality of corruption across Europe. While many countries in Europe are known for their strong institutions and transparent governance, there are still several nations where corruption continues to be a significant issue. From political elites using their influence for personal gain to the manipulation of public funds and contracts, corruption remains deeply rooted in various sectors. We'll explore the top 15 most corrupt countries in Europe in 2024, examining the factors that contribute to this problem, the sectors most affected, and the ongoing efforts to combat it. Whether it's through political patronage, bribery, or lack of judicial accountability, these countries continue to face challenges in eradicating corruption. Stay tuned as we uncover the key details behind the most corrupt nations in Europe today. 15. Belarus. Belarus remains one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, with a highly centralized system of governance under the rule of President Alexander Lukashenko. Corruption is endemic, particularly in state-owned enterprises and the energy sector, where government officials and business elites often engage in embezzlement and bribery. The government maintains tight control over the economy, and much of the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few politically connected oligarchs. Public procurement processes are often manipulated to favor loyalists, with no accountability for the misuse of funds. Belarus's judiciary is highly dependent on the executive branch, which leads to selective prosecution and impunity for high-ranking officials involved in corruption. The media in Belarus is state-controlled, and journalists who expose corruption face arrest, harassment, and even physical violence. Despite occasional promises of reform, the Lukashenko regime has not made significant efforts to address corruption, and the country continues to be criticized by international organizations for its lack of transparency and accountability. Public protests against corruption and authoritarian rule have been met with violent crackdowns, and citizens face intimidation if they voice opposition. The absence of meaningful anti-corruption policies and the entrenched nature of corruption in the political system hinder any substantial progress in addressing the issue. 14. Turkey. Turkey faces a deep-rooted corruption problem that affects various sectors of the government and private industry. Corruption in Turkey is particularly evident in public procurement, with government contracts often awarded to politically connected firms, and in the energy sector, where deals are influenced by powerful elites. The judiciary, although officially independent, is often criticized for political interference, especially in high-profile cases involving government officials. The political system in Turkey has been described as a kleptocracy, where corruption is entrenched at the highest levels, with the ruling party accused of using state resources to enrich themselves and their allies. There have been numerous scandals involving embezzlement, bribery, and the manipulation of regulations to benefit influential business leaders. The media landscape is highly controlled, with independent journalists facing threats, imprisonment, and legal action for exposing corruption. Anti-corruption efforts have been undermined by the government's resistance to meaningful reform and its consolidation of power. While there have been some attempts to address corruption, particularly in response to international pressure, the political climate has made substantial change difficult. Public frustration with corruption and a lack of trust in institutions has led to widespread protests, but these have often been met with heavy-handed government responses. The government's lack of transparency and accountability continues to impede progress in combating corruption in Turkey. 13. Croatia. Corruption in Croatia is a persistent issue that affects both public and private sectors. The government and political parties are often accused of embezzlement, bribery, and cronyism, particularly in the areas of public procurement, infrastructure projects, and the distribution of EU funds. The judiciary is often criticized for its inefficiency and susceptibility to political influence. with corruption cases involving high-ranking officials rarely resulting in convictions. Despite having anti-corruption laws in place, enforcement remains weak, and the public sector continues to be plagued by bribery and nepotism. In particular, the healthcare and education systems are often cited as areas where corruption is prevalent. Croatia's efforts to join the EU led to significant anti-corruption reforms, but progress has been slow. The country's political elite is often seen as being resistant to meaningful change, with many reforms either stalled or watered down. Investigative journalists and civil society groups continue to expose corruption, but they face significant risks, including threats and legal action. Public dissatisfaction with corruption has led to protests, particularly during periods of economic hardship, but the political establishment has been slow to respond to public demands for accountability and transparency. Despite some international support and pressure for reforms, Croatia's corruption challenges persist and hinder its overall development. 12. Hungary. Corruption in Hungary has become increasingly institutionalized, with allegations of misuse of EU funds, cronyism, and favoritism dominating its political landscape. Under the current government, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, critics argue that public institutions have been weakened and transparency has declined. Public procurement is a major area of concern, with contracts often awarded to businesses close to the ruling party. The European Union has repeatedly raised alarms about the misuse of EU funds in Hungary, suspending payments and calling for stronger safeguards. Judicial independence has also been questioned, with political influence over the judiciary undermining the rule of law. Civil society and investigative journalists play a crucial role in uncovering corruption, but they face increasing restrictions, including targeted legislation and media consolidation by pro-government entities. Transparency International consistently ranks Hungary among the worst in the EU for corruption perceptions. While anti-corruption frameworks exist, their enforcement is weak, and political elites are often seen as above the law. Public dissatisfaction with corruption is growing, with protests and international scrutiny placing pressure on the government to address systemic issues. However, meaningful progress will require stronger institutional independence and political will, both of which remain uncertain in the current climate. 11. Armenia. Armenia has long struggled with high levels of corruption, which affects nearly every sector, including government, business, and law enforcement. The country's political system has been characterized by a lack of transparency, with powerful political elites and oligarchs controlling key industries and public resources. Corruption is particularly prevalent in public procurement, where contracts are often awarded based on political connections rather than merit. The judicial system in Armenia has also been heavily criticized for its inefficiency and susceptibility to political interference, with high-ranking officials rarely facing consequences for corruption. Despite efforts to combat corruption, including the establishment of anti-corruption bodies and reforms, progress has been slow. In 2018, Armenia experienced a peaceful revolution that brought new leadership, with promises of tackling corruption, but the system remains resistant to change. Public dissatisfaction with corruption has led to protests and calls for reform, and there has been some movement toward improving transparency and accountability. However, Armenian leadership later revealed that pose significant obstacles. The country's anti-corruption efforts face challenges from both political elites and economic oligarchs, who continue to wield significant influence. Investigative journalists and civil society groups are crucial in exposing corruption, but they face threats, harassment, and legal pressure. Armenia's progress in reducing corruption will depend on the political will to implement and enforce meaningful reforms. 10. Romania. Romania struggles with systemic corruption, particularly in its political and judicial systems. While the country has made strides in combating corruption through the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, DNA, challenges remain. High-ranking officials, including politicians and public servants, are frequently implicated in corruption scandals involving bribery, embezzlement, and abuse of power. Public procurement and infrastructure projects are often tainted by favoritism and mismanagement, costing taxpayers millions. Judicial independence is under threat, with political interference undermining the fight against corruption. Transparency International ranks Romania poorly on its Corruption Perceptions Index, reflecting widespread dissatisfaction among citizens. While anti-corruption agencies have been effective in prosecuting cases, enforcement is inconsistent and political pressure often hampers their work. Civil society and investigative journalists have played a crucial role in exposing wrongdoing, but they face significant risks, including legal harassment and intimidation. The EU has been instrumental in driving anti-corruption reforms, linking progress to financial aid and integration milestones. Despite these efforts, everyday corruption, such as bribery for permits or medical services, continues to affect ordinary citizens. Romania's path forward will depend on strengthening institutions, ensuring judicial independence, and maintaining public pressure for accountability. Recent mass protests against corruption demonstrate growing civic engagement, signaling hope for long-term reform. 9. Bulgaria. Bulgaria continues to face deep-rooted corruption, impacting its political system, judiciary, and economy. Bribery, embezzlement, and misuse of public funds are widespread, particularly in public procurement and infrastructure projects. Political elites are often accused of cronyism, using their positions to benefit close allies and business partners. Despite being an EU member, Bulgaria remains one of the bloc's most corrupt countries, as ranked by Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Judicial independence is a critical concern, with courts frequently accused of being influenced by political and economic interests. Anti-corruption institutions exist, but are often criticized for their lack of autonomy and effectiveness, with high-profile cases rarely resulting in convictions. Public trust in government institutions is low, with citizens frequently encountering corruption in daily interactions, such as paying bribes for permits or access to healthcare. Civil society and investigative journalists have been pivotal in exposing corruption, but they often face intimidation or legal challenges. EU monitoring mechanisms, such as the Cooperation and Verification Mechanism, CVM, have pressured Bulgaria to implement reforms, leading to some progress. However, tangible results have been slow, and systemic corruption remains a significant barrier to development. Growing public protests and increased scrutiny from the EU offer hope for greater accountability and reform in the future. 8. Kosovo. Kosovo faces significant corruption challenges which hinder its development and international credibility. Corruption is prevalent across the public sector, particularly in procurement, customs, and the judiciary. Political patronage and cronyism are widespread, with many public officials accused of misusing their positions for personal or political gain. While Kosovo has introduced anti-corruption agencies and adopted legislation aimed at increasing transparency, enforcement remains weak and high-profile corruption cases rarely lead to convictions. The judiciary is often criticized for its inefficiency and susceptibility to political interference, further eroding public trust. International organizations, such as the EU and UN, have played a critical role in supporting anti-corruption efforts, but progress has been limited. Transparency International and other watchdogs rank Kosovo as one of Europe's most corrupt countries, with citizens frequently citing corruption as a major obstacle to economic and social development. Civil society and independent media have been active in exposing corruption, but journalists and activists often face threats and intimidation. Despite these challenges, there is a growing movement within Kosovo to demand accountability and reform. The government has recently pledged to strengthen anti-corruption efforts, and international pressure continues to push for greater transparency and accountability. Kosovo's success in combating corruption will be essential for its aspirations of closer integration with the EU and broader international recognition. 7. Montenegro. Montenegro faces persistent corruption issues, especially within its political and economic systems. Political elites and powerful business figures often collaborate in ways that undermine transparency and fairness, particularly in public procurement and urban development projects. Allegations of bribery, embezzlement, and nepotism are common, while law enforcement and judicial institutions are criticized for the lack of independence and effectiveness. The country's journey toward EU accession has placed anti-corruption reforms in the spotlight, but progress has been slow. Public trust in institutions remains low, as citizens frequently report experiencing corruption in their daily lives, such as bribery for access to healthcare or government services. Investigative journalists and civil society organizations have exposed numerous high-profile corruption cases, but many go unpunished due to political interference. International watchdogs like Transparency International consistently rank Montenegro poorly in terms of corruption perceptions. Despite these challenges, there have been some positive developments, such as the adoption of anti-corruption strategies and legislation aimed at increasing transparency in public finance. However, the lack of consistent enforcement undermines these efforts. Public dissatisfaction with corruption is growing, and there is increasing pressure from both domestic stakeholders and the EU to implement meaningful reforms. Montenegro's progress will depend on reducing political influence over key institutions and ensuring accountability at all levels of government. 6. Serbia. Serbia continues to face significant challenges in addressing corruption, which is pervasive across its political, judicial, and economic systems. The concentration of power within the ruling political elite has led to a culture of cronyism, with public officials often prioritizing personal and political interests over public welfare. Bribery and favoritism are widespread, particularly in public procurement and infrastructure projects, where contracts are frequently awarded to companies with close ties to the government. The judiciary lacks independence, and allegations of political interference in court decisions are common, undermining trust in the rule of law. Anti-corruption agencies exist, but are often criticized for their lack of effectiveness and autonomy. Transparency International ranks Serbia poorly on its Corruption Perceptions Index, reflecting widespread public dissatisfaction with governance. Media freedom has also been curtailed, with journalists who investigate corruption facing threats, harassment, or legal action. The EU has called on Serbia to improve transparency and tackle corruption as part of its accession process, but progress has been slow. Despite these challenges, grassroots organizations and independent media continue to shed light on corruption cases, and growing public awareness could drive demand for stronger reforms in the future. 5. Bosnia and Herzegovina. Corruption in Bosnia and Herzegovina remains deeply entrenched, posing a significant challenge to the country's governance and EU integration efforts. The political system, rooted in the Dayton Agreement that ended the Bosnian War, is highly fragmented, with ethnic-based political parties dominating governance. This structure has created opportunities for corruption and patronage. Bribery, nepotism, and embezzlement are common in public administration, healthcare, and law enforcement. Public procurement is particularly vulnerable, with contracts often awarded to companies linked to political figures. The judiciary, intended to act as a check on corruption, is itself riddled with allegations of bribery and political influence, undermining public trust. Despite international assistance, including from the EU and the Office of the High Representative, Anti-corruption efforts have been slow and inconsistent. Civil society and investigative journalists play a critical role in exposing corruption, but they often face threats and harassment. While some reforms have been initiated, such as improving transparency and public finance, political resistance and weak enforcement have limited their impact. Citizens frequently express frustration with corruption, citing it as a major obstacle to economic development and social cohesion. Nevertheless, increased international scrutiny and grassroots activism offers some hope for progress in the fight against corruption. 4. Albania. Corruption remains a major obstacle to Albania's progress toward EU integration. Bribery, nepotism, and abuse of power are widespread in public institutions, from the police force to healthcare services. The judiciary, in particular, has been plagued by corruption, with allegations of judges and prosecutors accepting bribes to influence decisions. Public procurement and infrastructure projects are also frequently marred by kickbacks and favoritism. While the Albanian government has initiated reforms, including vetting judicial officials and adopting anti-corruption laws, enforcement remains weak. Political elites and business interests often work hand in hand, creating a culture of impunity that undermines reform efforts. Transparency International consistently ranks Albania poorly on its Corruption Perceptions Index, reflecting a lack of trust in public institutions. Citizens regularly report encountering corruption in everyday interactions, such as obtaining permits or accessing public services. International organizations, including the EU, have been pressuring Albania to combat corruption as a prerequisite for accession talks. While civil society and investigative journalism have been active in exposing wrongdoing, journalists and activists often face threats and harassment. Despite these challenges, there is growing public demand for accountability, and recent prosecutions of high-ranking officials signal a potential shift toward greater transparency and governance. 3. Moldova. Moldova struggles with pervasive corruption, deeply entrenched in its political, economic, and judicial systems. Despite being one of Europe's smallest nations, its corruption scandals are significant. High-profile cases, such as the infamous 2014 billion-dollar theft from the banking system, revealed systemic weaknesses in governance and oversight. Corruption in Moldova often involves bribery, nepotism, and embezzlement, particularly in public administration and law enforcement. Political elites and oligarchs wield immense influence, undermining democratic processes and fair governance. While the government has launched anti-corruption initiatives, including the establishment of specialized agencies, these efforts are often undermined by a lack of political will and judicial independence. Citizens frequently face corruption in their daily lives, such as paying bribes for basic services or navigating a biased judicial system. Moldova's European integration aspirations have spurred some reforms, but tangible progress remains slow. The country's dependence on remittances and foreign aid has also led to concerns about the misuse of funds. Civil society and independent media play a critical role in exposing corruption, but they often face intimidation. Despite these challenges, recent political changes, including the election of pro-reform leaders, have raised hopes for greater transparency and accountability in the future. 2. Russia. Russia is widely regarded as one of the most corrupt nations in Europe, with systemic corruption deeply embedded in its political, economic, and social systems. The centralization of power under Vladimir Putin's administration has allowed an elite class of oligarchs and officials to dominate the nation's wealth and resources. Public officials frequently exploit their positions for personal gain, with bribes and embezzlement being common practices. Transparency International consistently ranks Russia poorly on its Corruption Perceptions Index, highlighting issues such as opaque public procurement processes and misuse of state-owned enterprises. Law enforcement and judiciary systems are often complicit in corruption, undermining justice and fostering a culture of impunity. Major industries, including oil, gas, and defense, are controlled by powerful individuals with close ties to the government, perpetuating cronyism and stifling fair competition. Anti-corruption activists and independent journalists who expose misconduct face severe repercussions, including imprisonment or exile. While the government occasionally conducts high-profile anti-corruption campaigns, these are often perceived as politically motivated rather than genuine attempts at reform. With limited avenues for accountability and public dissent suppressed, corruption remains a significant barrier to Russia's development and trust in its institutions. 1. Ukraine. Despite ongoing efforts to curb corruption, Ukraine remains one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. Corruption is deeply rooted in the country's political and economic systems, largely due to decades of oligarchic control and weak governance structures. Bribery is prevalent in various sectors, from healthcare and education to law enforcement and judiciary, significantly impacting everyday life. Public procurement and infrastructure projects are often marred by kickbacks and mismanagement, costing taxpayers billions. In recent years, Ukraine has made strides toward reform, including the establishment of anti-corruption agencies like the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, and a high anti-corruption court. However, these efforts are often undermined by political interference and lack of enforcement. International organizations, such as the EU and IMF, have pressured Ukraine to adopt stricter anti-corruption measures in exchange for financial aid, but tangible results remain limited. The ongoing conflict with Russia has exacerbated the situation, diverting resources away from governance reforms and creating new opportunities for corruption in defense and reconstruction efforts. Despite these challenges, there is growing public demand for transparency and accountability, driven by civil society and independent media, offering hope for long-term change.